Picture a German Panzer general, not a specific man. Think of him as the embodiment of the finest German armored thinking, the archetype of the brilliant tank commander that Germany produced better than any nation on earth. He is everything the German military tradition made possible, a master of maneuver, of the bold thrust, of the concentrated armored blow that shatters an enemy before he can react. He helped pioneer the way of war that conquered most of a continent in a matter of weeks. The lightning campaigns, the encirclements, the stunning victories that made the German army the most feared fighting force in the world. He fears almost nothing on a battlefield because he has seen almost everything and mastered it. He has faced the finest armies of Europe and defeated them. He understands tanks as few men ever have, how to mass them, how to lead them, how to strike with them like a rapier. In the war of movement, in the clash of armored forces, he is among the best there has ever been, and he knows it, and his confidence is earned. And yet, as the war goes on, this man, this master of armored warfare, this general who fears almost nothing, comes to feel a growing, gnawing dread about a particular enemy. Not because that enemy's generals are better than him, he does not believe they are. Not because that enemy's tanks are better than his, he knows they are not, but because that enemy possesses something against which all his brilliance, all his mastery, all his hard-won skill may ultimately be powerless. That enemy is the United States. And the thing he comes to fear is not the American army exactly. It is the American war machine, the vast, faceless, industrial thing behind the army. The thing he cannot outmaneuver or outfight, because it does not fight the way he understands fighting at all. This is the fear that crept into the minds of Germany's finest soldiers as the war turned, not the fear of being outfought, which they could understand and respect, but the fear of being outproduced, outsupplied, and ultimately buried by an enemy whose strength lay not in generalship or courage, but in something colder and more implacable, the sheer, overwhelming, inexhaustible output of the greatest industrial power the world had ever seen. This is not a story about a general. This is a forensic audit of a fear, of why Germany's best armored minds came to dread the American war machine above all things, of what they saw coming that they could not stop, and of the terrible realization that all their genius for war might be defeated not by a better warrior, but by a better factory. Part 1. The German Calculus. To understand the Panzer general's fear, you have to understand his genius first, because the fear is the shadow of the genius. It grows precisely from his ability to see, more clearly than lesser men, what he is truly facing. The German way of war that this general embodied was built on a specific and brilliant idea, that a smaller force, if it was better led, better trained, and more boldly handled, could defeat a larger one by maneuver, by concentrating force at the decisive point, striking faster than the enemy could react, and shattering his cohesion before his greater numbers could be brought to bear. This was the philosophy of the Lightning War, and it worked spectacularly against the armies of Europe, which were often larger than the German force, but slower, more cautious, and less well handled. The German general learned that numbers could be defeated by speed and skill, that a brilliant blow could overturn a material disadvantage, that the quality of the force and its leadership mattered more than its size. And this lesson, learned in victory after victory, was the foundation of his confidence. He had seen numbers defeated by skill. He had done it himself. He believed, with good reason, that a well-handled armored force could overcome a larger enemy, because he had proven it repeatedly. His whole art was the art of defeating a materially superior enemy through superior generalship and superior fighting quality. But here is where the fear begins, because the German general was intelligent enough to see the limits of his own philosophy, even as it was winning. The Lightning War worked by achieving a quick, decisive result before the enemy's greater resources could be mobilized and brought to bear. It was a strategy for winning fast, because in a short war, skill and boldness could triumph before mass could tell. But what if the war was not short? What if the enemy could not be knocked out quickly, could absorb the lightning blows and keep fighting, could trade space and time while mobilizing his vast resources? Then the whole logic reversed. Then the war became a long, grinding contest of endurance and production. Exactly the kind of war the German philosophy was not designed to win, and exactly the kind of war that a vast industrial power was designed to win. And when the German general turned his mind to the United States, this is precisely the fear that took shape, because the United States could not be knocked out quickly. It was too far away, too large, too protected by oceans. The lightning war could not reach it, and behind those oceans, the United States possessed an industrial capacity so vast that once it was fully mobilized and brought to bear, it would produce weapons and supplies in quantities that no amount of German skill could overcome. The German general looked at America and saw the one enemy his entire art was helpless against, an enemy that could not be defeated quickly, and that, in a long war, would outproduce Germany so overwhelmingly that skill and boldness would drown beneath the sheer flood of material. That is the German calculus, and the root of the fear. A general whose genius lay in defeating larger forces through speed and skill, in a short, decisive war, confronting an enemy who could not be defeated quickly, and who in a long war would bring to bear an industrial power so overwhelming that no amount of generalship could overcome it. The better the general understood his own art, the more clearly he saw that it had a fatal limit, and that the United States lay precisely beyond that limit, in the realm where factories, not generals, decide the outcome. And there is a particular moment that many thoughtful German officers experienced, in one form or another, the moment when the abstract fear became concrete. It came when they first truly grasped the American production figures. Perhaps it was an intelligence report crossing the desk, listing the number of tanks or aircraft the Americans were building in a single month. Perhaps it was a captured prisoner who spoke casually of the endless supplies behind him, as though such abundance were the most natural thing in the world. Perhaps it was a glimpse of an American factory floor stretching to the horizon, turning out war material without end. However it came, there was often a specific instant when a German officer looked at a single number, a monthly output figure, a shipping tonnage, a production total, and felt the floor drop away beneath him. Because the number was not a battlefield problem he could solve with skill. It was simply larger than anything Germany could answer, and it was still growing, and it meant that everything he was good at might not be enough. That was the moment the fear became real, not on a battlefield, where he was master, but at a desk, staring at a production figure that no amount of generalship could argue with. Now let us look at what, exactly, he saw coming. Part 2. The American Answer. What Germany's best Panzer general feared, when he looked across the ocean at the United States, was not the American soldier or the American general, whom he did not particularly respect at first. It was the American war machine, the industrial and logistical colossus that would, once fully mobilized, produce and deliver war material on a scale that would render his own brilliance irrelevant, and every element of that machine was something his art could not touch. He feared the production. The United States possessed the largest, most advanced, most productive industrial economy in the history of the world, and it was untouched by the war. No bombs fell on Detroit. No enemy overran the American heartland. Once that economy turned to war production, it would produce tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, guns, and ammunition in quantities that beggared belief, outproducing not just Germany, but very likely the entire rest of the world combined. The German general knew, as a matter of cold arithmetic, that no battlefield brilliance could overcome a productive disparity of that magnitude. You cannot maneuver your way out of being outnumbered 10-1 in tanks, indefinitely, forever, as every loss you inflict is instantly replaced, and every loss you suffer is permanent. The production was a force his generalship simply could not engage. He feared the logistics. It was not enough for America to produce this material. It had to deliver it across oceans to the battlefields of the world, and the German general saw that the Americans were building a logistical system capable of exactly that. The ships, the ports, the trucks, the whole vast apparatus of moving mountains of supply across the globe and delivering them to the front. An enemy who could produce overwhelmingly and also deliver overwhelmingly was an enemy whose material superiority would actually reach the battlefield, in full, continuously. The logistics, like the production, was something the general could not fight. He feared the replacement, the regeneration, the sheer inexhaustibility of it. In the war of maneuver, you could destroy an enemy force and win, because the destruction was decisive. But against the American war machine, destruction was not decisive, because everything was replaced. Destroy the tanks, and more came. Destroy them again, and more came still. The American war machine could absorb losses that would have been fatal to any other enemy and simply regenerate, endlessly, because its productive capacity was so vast that battlefield losses barely dented it. The general understood that fighting such an enemy was like fighting the sea. You could strike it as hard as you liked, and it simply closed over the wound and came on. And he feared what all of this meant for his own art. Everything he was brilliant at, the maneuver, the concentration, the decisive blow, was designed to produce a quick, war-winning result. But against an enemy who could not be knocked out, and who regenerated endlessly, the decisive blow became impossible. There was no single victory that could win the war, because the enemy could absorb any defeat and keep producing. The war would become exactly the long, grinding, material contest that his philosophy could not win, and in that contest, his genius would be slowly, inexorably buried beneath the flood of American material. The thing he feared most was not defeat in battle. He could imagine winning battles, and did. It was the futility of winning battles against an enemy who could not be beaten by battles at all. And here is the deepest and most bitter part of the fear. The German general could respect an enemy general who outmaneuvered him. That was war as he understood it. A contest of skill, and losing to a better soldier was honorable and comprehensible. But to be defeated not by a better general, but by a better factory, to have all his genius, all his hard-won mastery, rendered irrelevant by the faceless output of assembly lines a continent away, was a kind of defeat that struck at the very meaning of his profession. He was a master of the art of war, and the American war machine threatened to make the art of war irrelevant, to reduce the whole magnificent tradition of generalship to a footnote beneath the cold arithmetic of production. That was the fear beneath the fear. Not just that he would lose, but that the thing he was master of would no longer matter. The American general was not, in the Panzer general's eyes, his equal in the art of war. But the American war machine did not need a better general. It needed only to exist, and to produce, and to keep coming, until the finest generalship in the world drowned beneath a tide of material that no genius could stem. And that, the German general feared, was exactly what it would do. Part 3. The River of Steel. The Panzer general's fear connects to every theme this channel has developed, because his fear was, in essence, a clear-eyed prophecy of everything this channel has documented. A brilliant soldier seeing, in advance, the exact way the war would unfold and be lost. His fear was, first, a recognition of the theme of the system over the individual, seen from the losing side. Everything this channel has argued, that the war was decided not by the quality of individual weapons or soldiers or generals, but by the capacity of the whole system to produce and sustain, the Panzer general feared in advance. He understood that his own genius, the pinnacle of the individual quality approach to war, was about to be defeated by a systemic, industrial approach against which individual quality was helpless. His fear was the thesis of this channel, felt as dread by the man about to be destroyed by it. His fear was a recognition of the theme of production and numbers as the decisive factor. We have traced again and again how American productive capacity overwhelmed German quality, and the Panzer general saw this coming with perfect clarity. He knew the arithmetic. He knew that a sufficient disparity in production could not be overcome by any battlefield skill, and he knew that America represented exactly such a disparity. His fear was the quantitative reality of the war, understood in advance by a man intelligent enough to read his own doom in the production figures. His fear was a recognition of the theme of logistics and delivery, of the whole apparatus that converted American production into battlefield force. He feared not just that America could produce, but that it could deliver, that its material superiority would actually reach the front in full. And this too was prophetic, because the delivery of American abundance to the battlefield, the trucks, the ships, the supply lines, was exactly what this channel has documented as decisive. And his fear was, at the deepest level, a recognition of the theme that has run through everything, that in a long industrial war, the factory defeats the warrior. The Panzer general was the warrior in its highest form, the brilliant, skilled, courageous master of battle. And he feared, correctly, that he was about to be made obsolete by the factory, by the faceless industrial power that could produce war material faster than he could destroy it, and that would win the war not through skill or courage, but through sheer, overwhelming, inexhaustible output. His fear was the epitaph of the warrior in the age of industrial war, felt in advance by one of the greatest warriors of them all. The Panzer general, looking across the ocean at the American war machine, saw the future of war, and it was a future in which he, the brilliant individual master of battle, no longer mattered, because the factory had replaced him as the decisive force. And he feared it, correctly, because it was coming, and it would bury him and everything he represented beneath a tide of material that no genius could stem. Part 4. The German Realization. The realization that came to Germany's best armored minds, as the war turned, was the confirmation of the fear, the slow, grinding proof that everything they had dreaded was coming true, and that they were powerless to stop it. At first, the realization was resisted, because it was unbearable. These were men whose whole lives and identities were built on the belief that skill and boldness could overcome material disadvantage. They had proven it, gloriously, in the early campaigns. To accept that this was no longer true, that they were facing an enemy against whom skill could not prevail, was to accept the obsolescence of everything they were. And so, for a time, they told themselves that the next brilliant stroke, the next bold offensive, the next decisive blow, could still turn the war. That generalship could still triumph, if only it were bold enough and skilled enough. But the war ground on, and the realization became impossible to resist. Every German victory, however brilliant, changed nothing, because the enemy absorbed it and kept producing. Every German offensive, however bold, ran out of fuel and material and men, because Germany could not sustain it, while the enemy could sustain anything. The German generals watched their finest efforts, their most brilliant maneuvers, their most daring offensives, accomplish nothing lasting, because the American war machine simply regenerated whatever was destroyed and came on, inexhaustible. And slowly, they were forced to confront the truth their best minds had feared all along, that they were not fighting an enemy they could defeat, but a machine they could only delay. And the deepest realization was the one the Panzer general had feared most, that their art had been made irrelevant. The magnificent tradition of German generalship, the mastery of maneuver, the genius for the decisive blow, all of it, against the American war machine, accomplished nothing decisive, because the machine could not be beaten by battles. The generals could win engagements, and even offensives, and it did not matter, because the war was no longer being decided by engagements and offensives. It was being decided by production, by supply, by the inexhaustible output of factories a continent away, and against that, generalship was helpless. The most brilliant soldiers in the world were being defeated not by better soldiers, but by better factories, and there was nothing their brilliance could do about it. There is a particular tragedy in this realization, and the best German generals felt it fully. They were, many of them, genuine masters of their profession, men of real genius in the art of war, and they had the bitter clarity to see that their genius no longer mattered, that they had been born into the twilight of the warrior's age, when the individual master of battle was being replaced by the industrial machine as the decisive force in war. They were like master swordsmen in the age of the machine gun, supremely skilled at an art that the world had moved beyond, brilliant at a game that was no longer the game being played, and they knew it, and there was nothing they could do but fight on, brilliantly and futilely, as the war machine they had feared ground them and their magnificent, obsolete art into the dust. The Panzer general, watching his worst fears come true, understood at last that he had been right to be afraid. He had feared that the American war machine would render his genius irrelevant, and it had. He had feared that he would be defeated not by a better general, but by a better factory, and he was. And he had feared that all the brilliance and courage and skill of the German army would drown beneath a tide of American material that no genius could stem. And it did, exactly as he had foreseen, in the long, grinding years of the war's second half, when every German victory changed nothing, and every German defeat was permanent, and the war machine came on, and on, and on, until it had buried the finest army in the world beneath the sheer weight of its output. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in that war and faced the German army at its most skilled, or built the American war machine that ultimately overwhelmed it, in the factories and the shipyards and the supply lines, I would be grateful to hear his name in the comments. The German army was, man for man and general for general, one of the most formidable fighting forces in history, and defeating it took not just courage, but the overwhelming industrial power of a mobilized America. The men who built that power, as much as the men who fought, deserve to be remembered. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. The war ends, and Germany's best generals, the masters of maneuver, the geniuses of armored warfare, are defeated, their brilliance overwhelmed exactly as their most clear-eyed minds had feared, by the American war machine they could not outfight because it did not fight the way they understood war at all. So here is the verdict. Germany's best Panzer general feared the American war machine because he was intelligent enough to see what it truly was. Not an army to be outmaneuvered, not a general to be outfought, but an industrial colossus whose overwhelming, inexhaustible output would, in a long war, render all his genius irrelevant. He understood that his art, the art of defeating larger forces through speed and skill in a short, decisive war, had a fatal limit, and that the United States lay precisely beyond it, in the realm where factories, not generals, decide the outcome. And his fear was correct, in every particular. He feared the production, and America outproduced the world. He feared the logistics, and America delivered its abundance to every front. He feared the inexhaustible regeneration, and the American war machine absorbed every blow and came on. And he feared, most deeply, that his genius would be made irrelevant, that he would be defeated not by a better warrior, but by a better factory. And he was, exactly as he had foreseen. The verdict is the one this channel has reached from every direction, delivered here through the fear of the men who saw it coming most clearly. The war was decided not by generalship or courage or skill, in which the Germans were often superior, but by industrial power, in which the Americans were overwhelming. And the best German generals feared this precisely because they were the best, because they were clear-eyed enough to see that their magnificent art was about to be made obsolete by the faceless output of the greatest industrial power in history. The German general was a master of the art of war. And the American war machine did not need to master the art of war. It needed only to bury it, beneath a tide of tanks and trucks and aircraft and ammunition, so vast that no genius could stem it, until the finest generalship in the world drowned in the sheer, cold, inexhaustible arithmetic of production. The Panzer general feared that the factory would defeat the warrior, and it did. And in that defeat was written not just the end of Germany's war, but the end of an age, the twilight of the individual master of battle, and the dawn of the age in which wars are won, above all, by the machine that builds the machines. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the general who feared the war machine. Nobody makes a film about a general's fear, about the cold dread that crept into the minds of Germany's finest soldiers as they looked across the ocean and saw, coming, a thing they could not fight. The films are about the battles, the brilliant maneuvers, the clash of armor, and those were real, and the German generals were often magnificent in them. But the best of them were afraid, and their fear was the truest insight of the war. Because they could see, as lesser men could not, that all their brilliance was about to be made irrelevant, that they were facing not an enemy but a machine, not a general but a factory, not a force to be outfought, but a tide to be drowned beneath. And they feared it, correctly, because it was coming, and there was nothing their genius could do to stop it. Mostly, the German generals fought on, brilliantly and futilely, against an enemy who did not need to be brilliant, who needed only to produce and deliver and keep coming, until the finest army in the world lay buried beneath the output of the greatest war machine ever built. They deserve to be remembered, the brilliant, doomed masters of a dying art, and the faceless industrial power that buried them, by the hard truth that in the end, the warrior feared the factory, and the warrior was right to be afraid, because the factory won.